Okay, so this webinar is going to go over Chapter 1, all three sections. If you are attending it live, there are poll questions for you to answer. They are just practice questions. They are not graded, and no one can see your individual answers, just the group's results as a whole. So please participate in all of those. We just kind of use them as reviews, use them to keep your brain warmed up, and so that I can see if everybody's getting them all wrong. I know, oh, I better go back and re-explain it. So it's important that you answer those. And if you're here live, you can ask questions anytime by typing in the question section on GoToWebinar. And if you're doing this on a mobile device, you get that by just clicking the little question mark. And if you're watching the recording later, then you can just watch the presentation, and at the end you'll see how to contact your instructors. Okay, so chapter 1 is really an introduction to science in general and to biology. It's just called the science of biology. So it starts off with what is science? So how do we define science? This is more complicated than it sounds. Science is a process, an organized way of gathering information and analyzing it to reach conclusions. We can also say that science is the word used to describe the information that has been learned from scientific studies. So those are two different ways that we define science. They're both correct. They're both talking about different aspects of science. And what are the goals of science? Mainly understanding the world around us, using patterns in nature to make predictions, and solving practical problems, problems that would improve the world in some way. So these are the goals that are listed in your textbook. And then in defining science, we have to think about why science is important and what makes science special and why science is a little different than the other things that we may think about in our lives. So science relies very much on organization and attention to detail to collect information and draw conclusions that are valid. We'll talk more about the way that experiments designed and why that is important, but the organization is a huge part of it. And science never accepts anything based on belief. Science relies on evidence. But science is always changing our understanding of the world. Scientists don't prove things. They find evidence that an idea is true. So rarely does science say this is 100% true, we've proven this absolutely. They would more likely say, well, we have all of this evidence that's true. We're accepting this is true. There's no reason not to. So that's kind of the idea with science. It's not universal truths. It's we have lots of evidence pointing in this direction, so we're all going to accept this. And those conclusions may change as more evidence is discovered. So when you read throughout history, hundreds of years ago, science experiments showed certain things, and that's what we accepted. But as we got more evidence to show better explanations for those things we were seeing, our ideas changed, and that's going to continue happening as long as humans are studying things. Okay, there's different levels of scientific acceptance that change depending on how much evidence has been found to support an idea. So we'll talk about it a little more, but basically you have one person with an idea and they have one experiment that shows that it might be true, all the way up to things that we've had thousands of experiments showing that it's true, and it's generally accepted by everyone and everywhere in between. So we've got lots of different levels of acceptance. So science, like we said, is kind of based on organization, and it's a process. So your book talks about the scientific methodology, and the scientific method generally consists of several steps. They are observation, hypothesis, experiment, analyzing data, drawing conclusions, and then your book kind of mentions it later, not in this list, but sharing your results is an important part of this as well. So let's talk about some of those in general. Observations would be noticing something in the world around us, and that leads to questions. Okay, then scientists consider what the explanation might be for their observations and what the answer might be to their questions. And they create a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a possible explanation for something that can be tested. So these are the beginning steps of a scientific method. It's just figuring out what we're going to test, what we're looking to figure out, what we expect to see. So we have observations, we have a hypothesis. But definitely remember that word, a possible explanation for something that can be tested. Once you've got that far, a hypothesis is tested by running an experiment. The experiment would have to be specifically designed just to give that information, testing whether your hypothesis is true or false. All experiments have factors that can change, and those factors are called variables. And we talk a lot about controlled experiments. A controlled experiment only has one variable that is changed, and the rest must stay the same. The reason is so that the scientists can see the results of changing just one variable. So, for example, if you wanted to test to see if a certain fertilizer made tomato plants grow more tomatoes, you couldn't use a fertilizer on some plants that were watered every day and grown in the shade and surrounded by weeds, but compare them to plants that were watered once a week and grown in the sun and kept clear of weeds. Because there's so many variables, there's so many different things that could affect the plant's growth, you would have no idea if it was the fertilizer that was having any effect. So instead, controlled experiments are set up so that everything is exactly the same except for one single controlled variable. So they might take half of these plants and put the fertilizer on them, and half of them without the fertilizer, but everything else is going to be the same. They'd be grown in the same place, given the same amount of water, all of that, so that you could see that any difference in between them would just be caused by the fertilizer. So that's what we call a controlled experiment. Controlled experiments, they only have one variable that's changed by the scientists. Now, we say a controlled experiment only has one variable that's changed by the scientist, but in a controlled experiment there are technically two variables. There's the one that the scientists change called the independent variable. So in our example about the tomatoes, it'd be whether there is fertilizer or not. Fertilizer is the independent variable. But by changing one variable, you expect to see a change in the results. Okay, you expect to see something different. And that result that changes is called the independent variable. So again, back to my little tomato plant example, the independent variable, the one that's changed, is whether or not we use fertilizer. The dependent variable is how many tomatoes grow. And I see now that I have a typo on here, so I'm going to fix that right away. 1 second. All right, the one that changes is called the dependent variable. Sorry about that. Okay, that's an important difference. Okay, so sorry about that. So whether or not the tomatoes have fertilizer, that's the independent variable. That's the one that scientists change on purpose. And then the result that they're looking for in that example is how many tomatoes grow on the tomato plants. That's called the dependent variable. Okay, so that's the result that changes. So those are the two variables, and we still say in a controlled experiment there's only one that's changed on purpose. The scientists specifically say we're going to change one thing at the beginning. In this case it'd be whether or not there's fertilizer. So there's only one thing that's allowed to be changed at the beginning, and then the result is the dependent variable. Okay. So experiments are often divided into groups. They usually are. where you have many test subjects, but they're divided up. So you have the experimental group, which is the one that gets tested, and the control group that's there for a comparison. So back to our tomato plant example, the experimental group would be the ones that get the fertilizer, but we don't know if the fertilizer works unless we can compare it to plants that didn't get fertilizer. So in that case, we need a control group, and that would be these plants over here that are not getting fertilizer. So experimental group gets some treatment that's being tested, and in the control group, everything else is kept exactly the same except for that one variable. Oops, sorry. And then one more thing in that section is they kind of talk about qualities of scientists. The scientists are curious because the scientific method starts with asking questions and looking for the answers. Scientists are skeptical. They question beliefs and look for evidence. So just because somebody tells you something, it's not necessarily true. So scientists would look for some evidence to back it up. But at the same time, scientists are open-minded. They have to accept the evidence they find, even if it contradicts what they previously thought. So if they find results that say one thing, even if it wasn't what they were expecting to see, they have to believe that those results are true, or at least do more experiments to find out more about those results and why they're true and why they're getting them. You can't just reject the results that you get in science. And scientists have to be creative in designing experiments. So that's what we have for section 1. So I'm going to bring up some polls to review. Let me bring those up. All right, there we go. So which of the following puts the steps of the scientific method in the correct order? So we have 4 different options. They all have the same steps, just in mixed up orders. So I'll give you 1 minute to answer that, and then we can move on. But I can't move on until we get almost everybody answering it. Okay, well, it looks like almost everybody voted, so I'm going to close it down. And most people went with the correct answer of observation, hypothesis, experiment, analyzing data, and drawing conclusions. So remember back to the scientific method, a few people put the wrong order. So let's go over what we have to do. Scientists have to notice something that they want to ask questions about. Then they have to come up with a hypothesis. That's what they expect is the explanation, what they're testing to see if it's the right answer. Once they know what they want to test, they do the experiment. You can't analyze data or draw conclusions until you have the experiment. So the experiment will give you data. Data is just the information that you get from it. So let's just keep going with that example of the tomato plants. Your data would just be how many tomatoes do the plants grow. You're going to say, okay, the ones with the fertilizer each grew 10 tomatoes. The ones without it, they each grew 5 tomatoes. Well, that's your data. And then the next part would be drawing conclusions. And you would say, well, I can conclude that the fertilizer made those plants grow more tomatoes. Okay, so we can't really do it out of order. In option A here, we have observation, drawing conclusions, hypothesis. Well, we can't have drawing conclusions before we actually get any data. We can't draw conclusions until we have some information to look at. So you need to do the experiment first. Same thing here. For option C, we have observations, and then we have analyzing data. Well, you get your data from the experiment, so we can't do that before the experiment. And D, we have hypothesis, experiment, drawing conclusions, analyzing data, observation. So that one's close. It makes a lot of sense. It's just that observation here is something that needs to be at the beginning because it starts with noticing something that we want to ask questions about. All right, we have one more poll, which is a little bit shorter. In a controlled experiment, scientists change the blank variable on purpose, and then the blank variable is seen in the results. So I'm going to launch that, give you a minute to answer this one. So you have two answers, you have two blanks. So the first one would go in the first blank, the second one would go in the second blank. So is it the experimental variable and the control variable? Is it the dependent and the independent variable? Is it the independent and the dependent variable? Or is it the controlling variable and the experimenting variable? Okay, I see we got the votes in a little quicker this time, so that's cool. Most people went with the third option, but we had a few other choices. So that is, whoops, that box is in the wrong place. Oh, right, sorry about that. Okay, that is the correct answer. So in a controlled experiment, scientists change the independent variable on purpose, and the dependent variable is seen in the results. So I know we had a few people say experimental and control. Those are important words, but they mean something else. Those are the groups being studied. So in our example of the plants with the fertilizer, experimental and control are the different groups of plants. So we're going to say half of the plants will get fertilizer and half of them won't. The groups of plants are the experimental group and the control group. But what's being changed is the variables. So in that example, the variable is the fertilizer. Okay, some of them get it, some of them don't. So the independent variable is which plants get fertilizer, and the dependent variable is how well the plants grow or how well the plants produce tomatoes. Okay, so make sure that you remember those words for your test, your independent variable and your dependent variable, and you will also need to know experimental group and control group, so don't forget what those are. And I think that's it for review, and we're moving on to section 2. So chapter 1, section 2 is about communicating results. So once scientists have reached a conclusion after their experiments, they share their work with others. Getting that information out there allows scientists to build on their work, and it can allow for problems to be solved based on their work. So if scientists are looking up something that's going to give us information on how to make our lives better, that's really important that they share their work. Now, when scientists share their work, an important step in that process is called peer review. They publish a paper containing their work, and other scientists review it and make sure it is up to the standards set by the scientific community. They don't check that everything is correct, that they did the science and got correct results, but what they check is that it is an acceptable experiment, that it's set up according to standards, and we can trust that their results will be at least mostly correct. And this helps prevent papers from being published if the experiment was done really poorly and may have inaccurate results. Okay, so you will need to know that. That is peer review. And then we base a lot of information that we have on the results of experiments. So we need to talk about what scientific theory is. Scientific theory, theory itself is a word that people use in everyday language differently than the way that scientists use it. Okay, we kind of use it wrong. But in science, a scientific theory is an explanation that is well tested and generally accepted by scientists. So we tend to say, well, I have a theory when you just have an idea and it sounds like a good idea, but you're not really sure that it's right. That's not what it means in science. A scientific theory is something that has been tested by many different scientists in many different ways, and there's lots of evidence coming in from different directions to support it and to say, yes, this is probably correct. It's still not considered an absolute truth. As more evidence is found, a theory can be altered or replaced. But a scientific theory can be used to make predictions about the natural world. And I'll talk more about that on this slide, where we're also talking about the difference between a scientific theory and scientific law, because people also tend to confuse what those means. So the easy way to remember it is a scientific law is something that always happens, and a theory is our explanation for it. So for example, a scientific law is that if you drop an object, it will fall to the ground. Okay, that always happens. Every time you drop something, it falls down. The theory is our explanation. Well, why does that happen? And our explanation is that gravity is the force pulling the objects towards the earth. Okay, so the law is what happens, and the theory is our explanation. So scientific law doesn't change ever, but scientific theory does get altered as we find more information about it. So going on with this example of dropping things, Isaac Newton was the first person to really explain a theory of gravity. And his theory made a lot of sense mathematically. It's something that we still use today when we're doing engineering and things like that. It's very practical, and he had a sort of explanation for why it happened. And then we've been using that theory for hundreds of years, and then more modern scientists have kind of changed it. Einstein's theory of general relativity does also explain why gravity happens. And it's a different explanation than Newton's. It doesn't make Newton's work completely wrong. Most of it still makes sense. Most of it's still used today. But Einstein's work altered the ideas behind why it happens, and other scientists since then have continued working with that. So it's just an example of scientific theory being altered with more evidence being found. Okay. This section talks a lot about science and society and the role of science in society, but an important thing that it mentions in that discussion is bias. So bias is a preference or point of view that is personal rather than scientific. Okay, so it's sort of what you want to believe, what you have believed before, what you expect the answer to be. And scientists try to avoid bias and try to be very objective and say, this is the data, this is what the data tells us. We can't go on thinking anything else. Unfortunately, scientific information can be misrepresented when people are presenting it to support a certain point. So this is one reason that it's really important as people that aren't professional scientists, it's still important that you understand basic science and scientific methodology so that if someone is trying to misrepresent scientific information, you might be able to notice that that's happening and figure out where they might be biased and what they're trying to tell you that isn't true. Okay, and the role of science in society? Well, science is used to answer practical problems, such as science developing technology for improved transportation and communication and agriculture. Science is used to address societal issues such as hunger and diseases, and it's used to help make decisions and create policies, such as putting laws in place to protect parts of the ecosystem that are valuable to us. All right, and we got review questions for this section. So I'll launch this one. When scientists publish their work and other scientists check to see if it meets the standards, what's it called? Okay, so there's your poll. I'll give you a minute. Okay, I'd like to get 2 more votes in before our time is up so that we have a whole 75%. That's what we had on the last poll. Okay, thank you. All right, so good job. So 70% of people had the correct answer, which is peer review. So scientists checking other scientists' work to make sure it meets the right standards so that it's okay to publish it is called peer review. So I saw a few people answered control group. That is part of an experiment. That is one of the groups of subjects being tested in an experiment. And then the other two are not something that we talked about in this lesson. They were just distractor answers. Okay, so remember the term peer review for your test. And here's our next review question for this section. When is a scientific theory created? So we do lots of experiments at one point. There we go. At one point is the scientific theory created. Before the experiment is done, after one experiment is done, after many supporting experiments, or during peer review. Okay, so I'll give you another minute to answer this one. Okay, again, we're almost there. I'd like to see 2 more votes in there so we get up to the same percentage we had before, please. All right, well, we got one more. Thank you. Okay, so this is a little bit concerning. We have a pretty split vote here. Um, I'm gonna close the poll. So then our answer, the correct answer when a scientific theory is developed is after many supporting experiments. Now, most people that said a different answer said this one before an experiment, and that is what we call a hypothesis. So let's talk about that for a minute. A hypothesis, which I'm going to slowly spell out here. All right. A hypothesis is what we expect to happen or what we think the answer might be. So unfortunately, it's confusing because I know in, real life outside of the scientific classroom or the science lab, that's how people use the word theory. When you have an idea that you think might be the truth, you say, I have a theory. That's not how it works in science. That's not the way to use that word. So what that is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is before we do an experiment, we say, I think this is what's happening. I think this might be the answer. This might be how we can explain it. And then you do an experiment to test it. A scientific theory, though, is what's developed after many supporting experiments. Okay, so something like the theory of gravity, where we have lots of different scientists coming from lots of different fields that all support the idea that um, gravity happens because the mass of the Earth is pulling on other things, and the masses of all bodies pull on each other. There's lots and lots and lots of data to back that up. There's hundreds of years worth of it. So we can alter different parts of it, but the main idea there, it has been backed up by lots of science. Okay, so that's a scientific theory, lots of support for it. A hypothesis, there's no support for it at all because we haven't done the experiment yet. Right? So make sure you know the difference between those, study those words, hypothesis and theory. Um, very important to know. All right, and that takes us to the third section in this chapter, studying life. And this is going to be kind of short because your book has some lists of main ideas that are in there that you need to read yourself. So biology is the study of life. And so just saying that leads us to this question, well, what is life? What is considered living? So something that is living has to meet all of these requirements. Made up of cells, or at least one cell, able to obtain and use materials. So that sounds kind of funky. What does that mean? It means they have to take stuff from outside, from their environment, and use it to help them live. Okay? Humans eat food. We're obtaining materials from outside, putting it inside, and it helps us live. Okay, we breathe in oxygen. So all living things do that. Trees breathe in carbon dioxide. They soak up water. Bacteria take in nutrients. Everything needs to take in materials. Also energy. They need a source of energy. Um, every living thing does that. Every living thing grows and develops. Okay, so we generally think of things being born small and then they get bigger and develop, you know, more more complexly, and that's true of all living things. They have the ability to reproduce. They respond to their environment in some way or other. So some things respond more strongly than others, obviously, but all living things need to be able to respond to some parts of their environment. So even something like trees, where as far as we can tell trees just kind of stand there. When you look at them more in depth, they do respond to their environment. They grow and develop in the spring when the weather is warmer. They make fruits in the summer. The leaves turn brown in the fall, so just the seasons are enough to change some aspects of the tree. Maintain a stable internal environment. This is one that we talk about in the book a lot later. It's called homeostasis. And this just means that living things maintain what's going on inside despite what's happening outside. So a really simple example of that is that your body temperature is always 98 degrees, somewhere around there. It doesn't matter if outside the temperature is 40 degrees or outside the temperature is 100 degrees, your body is still maintaining 98.6. So different living things have different things that they maintain, but they all have that in common. They're maintaining something. They change over time, so they're not completely static and frozen. Something's always changing, and they have a universal genetic code. So every living thing has DNA. That's right here, DNA, and that codes for what their bodies make. So this is a big long list. You might want to go over it a couple of times in your book, but for something to be considered alive, it has to meet all of these requirements. So if it only meets one or two of them, it's not considered alive. It has to be all or nothing. All right. Then your book talks about the big ideas in biology. This is on pages 16 and 17. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. I'm just going to go through a couple examples, but you're definitely going to want to make sure that you go back, you read those pages carefully, read all 10 examples that they give you, because these are things that will be in the book and this class over and over and over. There's stuff that's going to be talked about throughout the whole class. So you definitely want to start out with this foundation of understanding just these very basics of what those big ideas are. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples here. The cellular basis of life is that all living things are made up of cells. Each cell can perform all of the functions of life that we described on the last slide. And large organisms are built up out of billions of cells. Okay, so this is something that's discussed a lot in lesson 2. The next one is the relationships of matter and energy. These are huge ideas. Living things use energy to incorporate matter into their bodies so that they can grow, so that they can function. They go through chemical reactions that release energy from matter. So all of life requires a supply of energy to keep going, which is also something we talked about on the last slide. All living things take in energy. So this use of energy and matter is a huge one. Growth, development, and reproduction, also a big idea in biology. Like I said, living things are born small and then they get bigger and they develop and their bodies get more complex. So that's something we talk a lot about in lesson 6, but also before that. And interdependence in nature is a big idea that no living thing is independent. All living things are affected by others, and their relationships determine how energy is used. So it's all connected. So again, those are just some quick examples, but definitely read pages 16 and 17 in your textbook, study them, understand all these main concepts because they're going to be applied to different topics over and over throughout the course. And the last thing that talks about in this section is different fields of biology, and it just highlights a few. It highlights these on the screen. Global ecology is the way that living things, especially humans, affect other living things around the world. Studying the ecology and evolution of disease is studying how viruses and bacteria change and how they infect people. Genomics is studying DNA. Biotechnology is about reading DNA and manipulating the genetic code. Building the tree of life is classifying all of the living things on Earth. But these are just a few of the fields of biology. There are many, many more. There's some that are related to these but more specific, and then there's other ones that are just completely different branches. So you will see some other ones mentioned throughout the book when it talks about careers in biology, so keep an eye out for that. Okay, and that brings us to our last review questions. So, there we go. Um, I think the question on the screen now is a little bit different than the one um, on the PowerPoint because of the way that GoToWebinar makes me format them. So sorry about that. Um, so just answer that one and we will go from there. Okay, and yeah, the question you're seeing is which of the following would indicate that something is not alive? So remember, it has to meet all of those checklist requirements to be alive, um, and there's one here that would indicate that no, it's not. Okay, so we've got half of our people have voted, so we're going to need a few more votes before we can move on. Okay, so we've got almost everybody answered, and we'll go through our answers here. Most people said the right thing. So the correct answer would be it does not use any energy. That would indicate that something is not alive because all living things require energy. Um, I see somebody said its internal environment does not change. So if you said that, you um, might be thinking about it a little bit backwards. And I don't. I guess my question wasn't all that specific, so I'm sorry if you said that answer. Um, because the idea is that if something is alive, its internal environment doesn't change just because the outside does. It doesn't mean that it doesn't change ever. Obviously, things grow and develop and things inside change a bit. Um, but what I was trying to get at was that, again, you maintain the same temperature inside even if it gets warm out or it gets cold out. So you go outside and it's 50 degrees, your internal body temperature still stays at 98. So that's a sign of being a living thing that you can maintain internal conditions. Um, Reproducing is something that living things do, and they grow. So remember, a living thing must have all of those characteristics to be considered alive. If it's missing any of them, it's not considered alive. There's very few things that are in that weird gray area where they have some of those characteristics, but not all of them. But there's one or two. Basically, viruses are the only ones I can think of now where they have some of those characteristics, but not all, so they're not considered alive. And our last review question is about those fields of biology we just talked about. So, which field of biology is about manipulating the genetic code? So, changing organisms to make them genetically modified organisms so they come out differently. So, is that biotechnology, ecology, the tree of life, or studying the evolution of diseases? So, I'll give you 1 minute to vote. Okay, so I know this one we just went over really quickly, so it's okay if you didn't get it right this time, but that does mean you need to go back and look at in your textbook what those different um, fields of biology are. So the correct answer is biotechnology. So that means reading and then manipulating the genetic code, which means you're genetically modifying things so that they're different than they would have been naturally. The other ones are fields of biology. Ecology is how things interact and relate to each other. The tree of life is organizing all of the living things and classifying what they are. And the evolution of diseases is studying how viruses and bacteria change and how that affects us differently. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this chapter. So if you have any questions, definitely ask them before you go. If you're watching this on a recording later, this is how you can contact your instructors. And definitely be sure to join us for our next webinars.